Good afternoon and thank you for joining this John Smith Centre Power Hour event. My name's Kezia Dugdale and I'm the Director of the John Smith Centre at Glasgow University. This is our 6th Power Hour event and I'm delighted to see so many of you back again. Let me also extend a warm welcome to those joining for the first time and also to those who are listening again to the podcast on the John Smith Centre website. We exist to make the positive case for politics and public service, and we do that in 3 ways: through research, through advocacy events like this, and through our structured internship programmes that operate in Scotland and across the United Kingdom. This Power Hour series is designed to take a different look at an aspect of power in each session, and we discuss it with a special invited guest who is a real leader in their field. This afternoon we're looking at the role of the Shadow Cabinet, and I'm thrilled to have with us Preet Kaur Gill, who is the MP for Birmingham Edgbaston and the Shadow Secretary of State for International Development. In the next 60 minutes, we're going to look at the merger of the Foreign Commonwealth Office and the Department for International Development and discuss what that might mean in practice. We'll talk about gender in international development and, of course, the Black Lives Matter movement more generally. But we're also keen to hear from you. You are very, very welcome, in fact, encouraged to put forward questions at every opportunity throughout the next 60 minutes. You can do that by clicking on the Q&A session button at the bottom of your screens. We'll be able to see those questions and I'll do my level best to factor them into the conversation we're going to have over the next 60 minutes. Some of you very kindly submitted questions in advance. I've got all of those in front of me and I'll be putting those to Preet shortly. So before we get to those questions, let's learn a little bit more about our guest. Welcome, Preet. Tell us how you got interested in politics.
Thank you so much, Kezia. I'm delighted to join you. Interestingly, my parents migrated from Punjab. My father was about 15 when he came over here, and my mother was about 8. And so my mother went to primary school here in the UK, and my father, unfortunately, wasn't able to go to finish his school. He hadn't finished it in India. And it was something that he always shared, you know, the importance of education and how education can change your life opportunities. My father came from a background of farmers. And so when he talked about his early childhood, he talked about going to school, but having to come back, and work with his brothers in the fields, and regularly talking about how difficult it was to study because, of course, the electricity used to go out and there would be power cuts, something that would happen on a daily basis. And so for him, the value of education was something really, really important. And despite not going to finish his schooling, he was really wanting to kind of learn and continue to learn. And so English was something that he took up, and he trained to then become an interpreter. And really recognized how positive that was. And so that was something that he definitely was going to instill in us from a very, very young age. I remember we'd, be at home, and when we'd hear the doorbell ring, we'd all pick up a book when my father came, because, there was no TV time at all. And when you'd finish reading your books, he'd say, but pick up a dictionary and learn new words and find out what it means. So for him, this was really, really important. I'm one of 7, and, we've got 5 daughters and two brothers. My parents, for lots of parents from my community, it seemed to be a big responsibility because you've got to marry off your daughters. My father was very progressive, though. He was very clear to us that, if we were going to do education, then he would fully support us and pushed us really from a very young age to think about, going to university and furthering our career. And of course, the typical careers that most people from my kind of background are, become a doctor or a dentist, go into business, for example. Politics was never really seen to be a career choice or, something that you would actually be pursuing right from the outset in terms of your A-levels, or when you went to study into university. But I was always interested in politics. I, took a sociology A-level, always engaged in my community. And I think a lot of that really stemmed with my father. He was very active in the Labour Party. So regularly, when I was a teenager, would be out campaigning, delivering leaflets, thinking, why on earth are we having to do this for my father? But what was really interesting, though, is that, many people used to say, gosh, we come to your house and your front room is like a railway station. And rightly so, because, there was a constant flow of people in and out of our house who always needed support. So my father was the president of the local temple in my area, one of the largest, one of the earliest ones in the region. And of course, a lot of the services we see now available in the 80s didn't actually exist. And so lots of our communities actually sought from places of worship, not just a place that they came to pray or, you know, pay for faith. It actually became an institution providing welfare support and lots of other services. And so form filling for people whose language was, you know, wasn't English as their first language, who'd migrated over here, was a big concern. So I was regularly having to complete people's forms when I was a teenager myself, or kind of give advice or ring somebody from an authority to really pursue that. But what that meant is I grew up with, you know, seeing my father really engage in kind of community initiatives and activities. And from a young age, there was a recession in Smethwick actually in the 80s when he was president. And we regularly used to see the miners, you know, given that the miners' strike was taking place, they'd be outside the Gurdwara with their buckets coming to collect money. But they would also come in and sit down with the community and have food and share. And so seeing those initiatives of communities coming together despite their backgrounds, despite their race, was something I grew up with, and I saw my father really advance. And it's wonderful to see those initiatives way back when actually they are the very things that we are still talking about, and the importance of those today. When there was a recession in Sandwell, there was a cheese factory across the road from the Gurdwara. And I remember my father going to purchase cheese, and we were wondering, what on earth are you going to do with all this cheese? And he'd put it in this big white van, and he would go and distribute it across Sandwell to all those families, regardless of their backgrounds, you know, making sure that, you know, they had a supply of food. And you had to be very creative with cheese in terms of cheese and potato pie is what I remember as being quite a common dish in our household during that time. But, you know, that concept of a food bank, that concept of actually your responsibility of giving back to all your communities around you, understanding the impact of that kind of recession is something that I really, you know, saw with my father. And I think that without realizing it, I guess, you know, that's where my interest in politics became, because my siblings used to think I was quite geeky. I'd watch Question Time and Politics Show and debate quite with my father, and they'd be like, oh, why are you so interested in all this issues? And I'd say, you know, actually I'm interested because it's important. One of the things that really inspired me about my father is in the early 80s when many Asian men would go back to India, for example, or, you know, from my community, and get married. And women would come over here. Many of these women came over here quite isolated because, of course, a lot of their family members were back home in India. They had very little relatives. But of course, English being a barrier for them, you know, not seeking work. And so many of them felt quite isolated. And the term domestic abuse has only come about much later. And services, therefore, directed to various communities were very minimal in those days. And it was very difficult to get the kind of support you needed. And I remember my father setting up, and I'm going to use the Indian term, Samaj Sadar. And basically what he did is he set up from the committee, he had a committee of members, and he'd been approached by a number of these women who talked about various difficulties that they would be facing with their marriage or with their in-laws, and seeking support from the Gurdwara. And I remember my dad set up this committee where it constituted of about 5 males. Wasn't very many women in committees in those days. And what they would do is if somebody had come to give them a complaint, they would turn up to their house, and sit down with the in-laws and the husband and sort of actually try to resolve these issues and find a solution to some of these issues. And I remember on many occasions my father late at night saying, come on, you've got to come with us, because having a female was something that he also saw as being very important. And he'd say, we're going to go to this house and I need you to sit and talk to this girl separately and make sure everything is okay. And if there's any problems, then you must ask her. You know, and then having to follow up some of those support situations. So I saw my dad be very, very progressive from a very young age, and as a woman never felt that he held me back with any kind of cultural pressures placed on him. But of course he couldn't have done any of the work that he did. You know, we hardly ever saw my father. Sometimes he'd be in meetings, he'd be back late home at night. My mother never drove, and so we'd miss so many family opportunities of gatherings, of get-togethers. But I never really saw my mum be disgruntled or really sort of share her pain or even feel that, you know, her dreams had to be put aside, because actually she was quite ambitious. She tells me now that she told my dad to go into property and he should have listened to her instead of, you know, not doing that. But of course, she had her own ambition and she worked. And a lot of the work that she did had to be at home. And she was a machinist because, of course, having 7 children going to work, my father was a bus driver doing various shifts, and they had to make things work. And so actually my father couldn't be the person he was today if it hadn't been for her, and if she hadn't supported him, and if she hadn't just carried on allowing him to be the person he was, and, you know, helping, encouraging us, because actually she was the one making sure we were doing our homework when we were at home. She was the one making sure that, you know, the family was kind of contained and kept together. So I remember going away to university, and then, I was very fortunate.
What did you study?
I did sociology, so I started off doing a sociology degree. I was quite unsure about what I wanted to do. I think at the time I thought I'd apply to be on the graduate program for Whitehall. And I remember looking into that and then looking at the salary in London and thinking, oh my gosh, if the starting salary of this, I'm not going to be able to survive here. And so I then, after 2 years, I veered off and did social work and got my social work qualification. I was very lucky as part of my course though on sociology. My lecturer, the head of social work, was actually a researcher and written for International Social Work Journal, was doing some great work in Papua New Guinea. So in my final year, we had the opportunity to study anywhere in the world. And I remember being affiliated to Delhi University and going to live and work in Delhi for 9 months to do my dissertation. I was always interested in that kind of cultural perspective of how states provide welfare for their citizens. And of course, in India, there is no welfare state provision. It's all delivered by non-government organizations. And that was a real, I think, eye-opener for me. It was an opportunity to really learn about myself, but also learn about what's happening in other countries, how systems are set up, how states and how governance takes place. Because of course, when when you're brought up in England, you kind of assume that democratic state is available, and democracy as we know it here is exactly the same, but of course it's not. So that was a wonderful opportunity. And actually, when I was in India, I was able to work with Plan International and UNICEF, and worked in some of the slums of Delhi with street children, and sort of really saw that kind of first-hand experience of development and the difference it can make, especially to the world's most poorest, because in India, we see the divide and the gap between the very rich and the very poor. And that's very, very difficult. And when I was in India, I was quite a young woman, still finding myself, finding my own identity. But I came across what was called the Widows' Colony. So many people will know in 1984, Amritsar, the holy shrine for the Sikhs, was attacked by the then Indian government at the time, and there was a massacre of thousands and thousands. And this was 10 years later from the massacre, and I stumbled on Widows' Colony. And really, these were women in 84 in October, when there was the mass orchestration of killings of Sikh men and young boys, which was very well documented. And I remember walking down that alleyway and the stench from the drains, and coming to these very slum dwellings, which I was really surprised and taken back by, and meeting these women who told me that 10 years later the world had suddenly forgotten them, and they hadn't received justice, and they were still seeking justice. And of course there was a human rights lawyer that was advocating on their behalf. But that really hit home to me in a way that I never really quite understood then. But later on, in terms of my interests and the things that I pursued, it became much apparent that I really cared about human rights issues, and these injustices that happen. How is it that we become very desensitized, or we assume because they're not happening here and they're so much distant that suddenly we don't have a role? But actually we have an important voice, because human rights actors don't always have the opportunity to raise these issues in their countries in safety. And I'm not saying that's just relevant to India, it's across the world we see those atrocities. So for me, that was a real sense of learning who I was. And before I went to India, I went and lived on a kibbutz in Israel. And again, this idea of communal living and how that worked, it was something that I had such great interest in. And it was just wonderful to sort of see, looking back on it now, in terms of that kind of conflict, but actually how many people on all sides of that debate actually want peace and actually work together. And it isn't a majority view in terms of trying to find a resolution, and how important it is that we do visit places that we, talk about from a foreign policy perspective, and do understand the plight of the very people that live there, and listen to them and hear what their concerns are, really. So I think, I was really interested in traveling. So when I finished university, one of the things I did social work is it enabled me to be able to work and then travel for a bit and come back. And I think what that did is it really kind of gave me a sense of myself and who I was and the things that were important. I think it's a luxury to be able to do that in a sense. Not everybody has those opportunities. But within that became, I was seen to be quite defiant. Because I wasn't choosing the kind of normal method in terms of my community and culture around getting married. And so it's almost seen like the black sheep of, oh my gosh, she just wants to travel and do her thing, as opposed to get married. And I got married much later on in life. I was grateful though that my father gave me that space, and he understood that actually there were other things that I felt were more important for me to learn and to follow up on, whether that was in social work in the UK, or whether it was my interest in sort of global projects that were taking place. So I remember just before I got married, I had tried on numerous occasions to get involved in my local Labour Party. And I thought, why don't I apply for a position? And I remember being blocked and thinking, oh gosh, this is strange. Surely I've got the right skills. I live in the ward. I'm active. I know lots of people here. Why is this so difficult? And why is it that they don't want me? And then I think that's the first kind of real eye-opener and lesson about politics, about understanding how the system works, because you come in it with a very naive perspective sometimes, and what that does then, it just kind of it makes you want to retreat back. And of course, if you do that, then you'll never really persevere in the very thing that you want to achieve. And so Lord King, who was the leader of the council in Sandwell, he became a lord by Tony Blair, given his advancements of the things that he achieved. He was a really strong sense of support for me, because he kept saying, we don't have enough women from our background, minority ethnic backgrounds in politics. It's really important your voices are heard. And you can do this alongside doing your own professional career. You don't have to give that up. And so becoming a councillor was something I then really started to think about. And I was blocked for about at least 3 years before actually being selected for the ward that I was in. But I think,
blocked?
So what I would say is, every time I would put myself forward, I was told, no, I'm not the right person. There's other people that are ahead of me. Or you just understood that actually the many males that controlled the kind of ward and who attended the meetings, it was really down to them as to who was going to be the next candidate. And so I very quickly learned that actually you needed to work with them if you had any chance and any opportunity. And of course, and that makes you question, well, what's wrong with the system, and why is the process in such a way that actually it doesn't recognize those that have got the ability, and there isn't this kind of fairness almost approach. And I think that's why it's really good that we don't have all male member wards, for example, and that we do have an opportunity for women to be part of those boards, because we do need that voice. Otherwise it'd be very difficult for us to get through into politics locally. So that didn't deter me. I kept pushing, and then in the end, actually, Lord King and my father then took me to meet with lots of community members and the key people in my ward, and I remember them grilling me on lots of issues and sort of asking me lots of questions, and then they agreed that they would absolutely come together and support me. So that journey from wanting to actually apply to actually then becoming a local candidate took some time. It took some understanding from my part as well, in terms of actually who are the influencers in this ward, who are the people that can make this kind of happen. And of course,
did you face those barriers again when you stood to be a member of Parliament, or had you overcome them because you were almost part of the establishment by being a councillor?
Well, I think because of the 27 election was very, very different in terms of how it was called. I think, I didn't have to go through a lot of what I hear from lots of women in terms of that process of selection from your local constituency, for example. So it's very different. But when I did become a councillor, I regularly, I remember in my first year, there was a post open for the member for children and families, and I remember putting myself forward because it was my background. I worked in the neighbouring authority as a children's services manager, had been in frontline social work for many, many years, over 10 years by that time. And I remember, I'll never forget it, because just the way it made me feel. I remember going into the leader's office, and I'd got there before Labour group, and I was sitting down in the chair, and the leader and the deputy leader came into the room because they wanted to have a discussion with me as to why I put myself forward. And I remember as they're sitting down, the leader is sort of saying, why have you put yourself forward for this role? And I was taken back, and I said, well, I have a background, and, this local authority has been failing its Ofsted for many, many years, and I really want to make a difference. I think I could actually provide lots of support. And I remember very quickly being told, well, that's not how it works, and you will have to wait your turn. There are people that have been councillors for over 10 years who haven't been on the cabinet, and, you've got to sort of wait your line. And I remember the tears falling down my eyes and thinking to myself, why have I got so upset? Why is this affecting me in such a way? And it's because I literally didn't expect that kind of a response. And I think, many of us, I think all of us, it's not just about females, but when we're coming into politics, we realize that actually, we have to understand sometimes how certain authorities function and the members within that function. And of course, it's not the case with everybody, but just actually where the structural barriers and difficulties actually are.
I want to ask you quite a bit more about that in a wee second, but can I just ask you something else about your dad just before we move on from your background? So on a few occasions you've talked about how progressive your dad was, particularly within the Sikh community. when I was a member of the Scottish Parliament, I worked quite closely with an organisation in Edinburgh called Sikh which provided a lot of welfare and pastoral support for young Sikh women in Edinburgh. And they taught me a lot about how Sikh women are often incredibly marginalised, even within sort of BAME community, that they were the most marginalised of all of the groups. So for your dad to be so progressive, which allowed you to have the political life that you do and the success that you now have, is quite unusual. Is that why you are the first female Sikh MP? Was that the key to opening the door? And how do you wear that identity as, you know, the country's first female Sikh MP? How do you use that power for the generations that will follow you?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think a lot of it is because of my father, and of course he was nationally renowned, but he was internationally renowned. So he was a person that not just within my community had that respect, but also outside of the community. He worked with the Harborne Parish, for example, with the Bangladeshi community. When he set up a community centre for the Sikh community, he also supported other communities to set up their own, and was, you know, was very participative in terms of sort of race equality initiatives locally, but also regionally as well. So yes, I think without his support, I don't think I would have got to where I was. And interestingly, you know, I lost my father in 2014 before I became an MP. Actually, it was his dream for me to become the first Sikh female MP. And I think what was really, really heartening is in the 2017 election, when I was knocking doors in my constituency, and it's my home seat, it's where I grew up, it's where I went to school, it's where my family live, it's where my father was a bus driver on the very famous number 11 route, it's where the bus station was, where I regularly went to when I was a young girl. You know, it was so encouraging to talk to a lot of people from my community who'd become Tory voters, by the way, because now they're in an affluent area and acquired wealth and assumed that that's what you do. And, you know, they were really encouraged to see me step forward. And they told me lots of stories of how my father had helped them, or how they remembered how he was as a president in the Gurdwara. And they thought it was really encouraging to see more women from our community step forward. And of course, there'd never been a Sikh female MP in this country. I mean, the last prominent Sikh woman 100 years ago that I can recall is Sophia Dalip Singh, who was the goddaughter of Queen Victoria, a very famous suffragette, you know, and a lot of people didn't know about her until Anita Anand wrote the book. And actually people are sort of reclaiming their history and, you know, discovering some of the impacts that they were able to make. So yeah, so that was really, really heartening to hear. Actually, my father had touched so many people's lives. And even though he wasn't there in the 2017 election, actually he was there because I was going to get a lot of support, and I was able to switch a lot of people to vote for me on this occasion because we hadn't had this first Sikh female MP. And interesting enough, going into that election, I think it's the kind of mentality as well. It's something that I think, you know, that building that confidence, because your confidence does get knocked. When I was a councillor, I was regularly told that I didn't need to attend various events and I should go home to my children, and I didn't need to worry myself about various situations. And of course, you've got to learn to pick and choose which battles you are going to take on, because otherwise it wastes your energy. But I think for me, I'm going to go back a little and come back to this point, is that when I was on the Jo Cox leadership program, I met 50 formidable, amazing women in the labour movement from across the country doing various roles. And it's the first time I've ever been to a training course where I've been quiet, because normally I like to have an opinion and voice my views on various things. And I just remember being overwhelmed and thinking, these amazing women exist that we don't really know always about, and we don't know about some of their stories, but how similar some of those struggles are. And actually they're trying to advance themselves, whether it's in the trade union movement, whether it's in local government or national activists or campaigners, that they have lots of similar stories to share and some of the barriers that we face together. But what was brilliant about that training course is it absolutely made us think about, do you know what the process is to become an MP? Do you know what the route is to achieve X? And I think that's so important, because when you embark on a journey, and in my mind, I always had that, do I want to be an MP? I didn't know the answer to that question. I found the answer to that question when I went on that course and when my father died, is I knew then that I was going to be the first Sikh female MP. And that's exactly how I said it. When people came to speak to me and they said, oh, what are you going to do? I said, I'm going to be the first Sikh female MP. And even in 2017, despite, you know, so many journalists and everybody sort of suggesting that we were going to lose Edgbaston, I says, no, I'm going to win this seat. And I was absolutely sure, that conviction from within, because I just knew that if you had a strategy, then you can do these things, but you've got to believe in yourself and you've got to motivate people around you and mobilize that level of support and just go for it. And so I immersed myself into that 6-week 2017 election. I didn't see my children. I was out from 10 till 9 p.m. pretty much every day. If I didn't have the support of my husband, and my family, there's no way I could have done that. And I think, that is another thing coming back to Sikh and Jorg, and I know them and they're brilliant and they're very active in Scotland, is, you do need your support from your partner. Before I became a counsellor, it's the conversation I had with my husband, and I remember the first reaction from him was, what does this mean for us as a family? Will people be knocking on our door? Does that mean when we're out, people are going to be stopping it? And that kind of intrusion and not understanding what it would mean. And when we sat down and I explained and we went through that, he kind of was able to sort of see the benefits of that. And he comes from a children's services background, so working on the front line as well, and sees the changes that you need to make, and kind of understood that I wanted to be part of a system that absolutely wanted to change, for lives for our communities and the betterment for them, really. So I mean, I think if that conversation had been very difficult, it would have been very difficult for me. I was pregnant when I was campaigning, when I became when I stood for my local election seat. It wasn't easy. Both of my girls, they're now 10 and 8, have grown up with me being in politics, and that's had its challenges for them, as it has for me as a mother. It isn't easy. And I remember when I was on the Jo Cox leadership programme, I was in Jess Phillips' office shadowing Jess, having a conversation about applying for Edgbaston, my home seat, knowing that Gisela was likely to step down on the next election, which was predicted to be in 2020. And I remember her and I talking about this, and I remember going home, and that was March, and speaking to my husband, and thankfully I did, and saying, actually, I really want to become an MP. I've been shadowing Jess, and it's amazing, remarkable what she's managed to achieve, and she's a great personality, but also a role model for so many women, because she just says it as it is, and that's so inspiring and so refreshing to see in politics, actually. My husband's fears were about, what does it mean about being away from the girls, because being their primary caregiver as their mother, that is difficult. And he was able to then sort of say, yes, okay, fine, as long as it means X amount of days you'll be away, but when you are here, then you are present. And of course, it never works out like that, because being an MP is yeah, as you know, Kezia.
So fascinating to hear about your background, but I'm so conscious we've got a lot of other areas that we need to cover, so I'm going to edge closer to some new topics. But before we get to your international development work, maybe we can talk a little bit about Black Lives Matters for a second or two, because I know people are keen to hear your thoughts on campaigns around removing statues, whether you've had to face that debate down in your own constituency. But just before we get to that, on a kind of more general point about representation, John Smith Centre exists to try and break down the barriers that people face accessing public life. And recently in Scotland, we've had 2 very powerful speeches in Parliament from Humza Yousaf, the Justice Secretary, and Anas Sarwar, who's a Labour MSP in Glasgow Central, saying, it's not just politics where BAME communities are underrepresented. It's right across the whole of public life here in Scotland. There's not a single Black or minority ethnic head teacher. There's not a single leader of a council or chief executive of a council of colour. There are no senior Black police officers in Scotland. There's literally nowhere you can look within civil society and see the type of people that you might aspire to be. Now, I'm not suggesting that you should have the answers, but if you could do 2 or 3 things to kind of break down what are clearly like staunch institutional and structural barriers, what does it take to help pull those walls down and encourage more people into different aspects of public service and public life?
I think it's been a question that's been on a lot of our minds, especially those people that have been calling for change, and whether it's, David Lammy talking about the recommendations that have not been implemented for the many reviews that government has taken about how do we address the sort of systemic structural racism that exists. And look, I work for Birmingham City Council, biggest employer in the region. And, when you look at the top tier sort of jobs, you don't see anybody from that looks like me, for example. Yet, in a couple of years, over 50% of Birmingham's population will be BAME predominantly. And so if you think about the procurement of about £1 billion that the city actually spends in terms of goods and services, and the very fact that those people in those very leadership positions that don't understand the demographic, because of course sometimes you're in a position in a local authority, you might not even live in that local authority, you don't really have a sense of what happens for communities on the ground, for example, especially if you're coming out from rural areas into a city environment. It's very easy for you to sort of leave. This is a debate that we're having in Birmingham. There's been challenge to the Commonwealth Games Board, and actually it's been really encouraging to see the Chief Executive, Ian Reid, state this week that actually one of the board members has stepped down to enable another woman, I think she's from the Caribbean, who has now stepped up into that role. So, where there is a will, we can make changes, but of course that's just one action. We need to know, how is it that, Black communities, for example, are overrepresented in the criminal justice system? What is the confidence and the relationship building that we need to have with communities? And I think this is the impact of austerity as well, because we're not talking to communities and engaging with them direct. We're assuming that we are delivering services that somehow meet their needs, and that is absolutely not true. I think locally, I've had young people from an independent school actually challenge the education system and the racism that exists in education, for example, and meeting with their senior leaders, but wanting to work across the city with all our maintained schools as well. And I think we've got to start from this premise of education. We've got to start with absolutely sharing, the history of empire and colonialism, so people do actually understand some of those communities that migrated here were actually part of the empire. I mean, they weren't migrants as such. My grandfather fought in the Second World War too, and that's the reason that my families were able to come over here and migrate. And we have so much shared history and so much more in common that we need to absolutely be talking about those issues. I think at a time where we see so many anti-globalists, I think this is a huge challenge for us. This is not a time to be retreating. I think if anything we can take from this pandemic, we're going to see movements of change. No longer are people going to accept that this is the status quo. And I think, we'll probably talk about the whole statues, but I don't want to get caught up in that cultural war, because for me, it's very clear, and the Labour Party has been very clear. This is about how do we change the systemic issues of racism and the institutions. And I've seen Chris Naylor, who's the current acting chief exec of Birmingham City Council, reach out to communities to say he wants to have a genuine conversation, talking to employers about actually what is it that employers can do differently. How do we recognize talent within organizations? How do we support that talent and nurture it? What is the support mechanism? When I worked in Birmingham, I faced huge amounts of, I felt I was being prevented from being promoted. And at some point, you've got to ask yourself a question: is it me, or what is it? I remember going to see a senior leader after I had been passed for promotion a number of times. And bearing in mind, I was always told that I'm a manager that excels. My team is doing excellently well. I remember sitting there and sort of saying, I've gone for this job and I haven't got it. Am I doing something wrong? And she looked at me and said, "Really good question, Preet. Really glad that you've asked. One of the things is we never see your vulnerable side." That, honestly, that was the response. So what it meant to me and how I took that away is, because you're confident and because you get on with it, and because you don't seek lots of assurances from us, or you're not constantly coming back to us, and obviously being challenging. I was always innovative. As I said, I was outspoken. I always had ideas of things that I wanted to change, quite passionate about the very things that we want to do. And why not? Because actually we're working in some of the most difficult areas of safeguarding children and their families. But bureaucracies, what happens though in big institutions is sometimes they just want a safe pair of hands, and they just want a yes person who's not going to rock the boat or challenge the senior leader. And unfortunately, that is the reality for a lot of women that I've spoken to, not just from my community, women per se, actually, about some of the barriers that they face when they're trying to progress. And that's the reality of it. What I had to do though is make peace with myself about that, and then realize that actually I was now going to focus on my political career. Because if I wasn't going to advance, I was not going to let this stop and deter me. And it was a year later that same senior manager sent me an email telling me how brilliant they thought I was and how I'd excelled, and how fantastic I'd done. And I thought to myself, did they really think I was waiting for them to tell me that information? This is really debilitating as well for women, because it does knock your confidence. Let's be clear about it. I was told on another occasion that I probably shouldn't apply for another job because I knew they had a safe pair of hands, a person that they had earmarked it for. But to discourage me for putting myself forward, actually that made me want to apply for it again, even though I knew they weren't going to give it to me. Because in myself, I had to prove that I wasn't going to let someone make me feel this way, or treat me this way. And it is upsetting. I remember coming home and breaking down in tears with my husband saying, I just really don't understand this. This is just, and him sort of saying, don't worry, there'll be other opportunities. Yes, I know there are other opportunities, but you have to make those yourself then. And so actually what happened as a result of not getting that promotion, I was promoted to the cabinet. And so actually that gave me another opportunity of actually having huge responsibility for public health and protection in Sandwell. from a leader that really believed in me and was able to push me forward. So we need to see lots more initiatives that absolutely understand the barriers, and we've got to do a lot more to address those across the board. And it's not good enough to say we just don't have the talent. We have a huge array of talent, because I hear this on a regular basis. They didn't have this expertise or skill set. That's just not good enough.
So it sounds like your success, and I don't mean to make you blush, is due to the strength of your character, just being so persistent at driving through. That's not enough though, is it, to make the type of change that we want to see? So I'm just wondering whether you think, or what you think the role of the state is in this. Are we at the stage now, if we're really serious about having equality of representation in all the walks of life which govern over our lives, we have to mandate that representation in positions of power? So should it be the case that the government sets targets for the number of BAME local authority leaders, or seats on boards, in the same way that we've had the discussion about 50-50 for women? Does it take that, or is there a sense that that's tokenistic? Would that not be accepted?
We have to ask ourselves the question, what is it going to take? Because we still do not have gender parity, and we're still having these conversations 100 years later that women have had the right to vote. 100 years it took to have the first Sikh female MP. So absolutely, we've got to be saying that boards have got to have 50-50 representation. I am all for that. It's far too often we are, I'm walking into a room, I'm the only female, sometimes I find myself, and then the only female of colour as well. And that can't be right in a region that is so diverse, and the richness of people from the Commonwealth that live here. How can it be that we just don't have those senior leaders when we are looking to them? So I think there has to be a mandate. I want to see us have much more leaders, female leaders. I think one of the great things about the Labour Party is the parliamentary Labour Party is now 51% female. And so it's only been done because of positive discrimination of having all women seats. Actually, we would never probably have reached this position if we didn't have that. I think the state has got a much bigger role. The race disparity audit, again, that Theresa May commissioned, what happened? The government is very good at doing the rhetoric, and it's very good at doing reviews. It's very poor at implementing and seeing that change. And we saw that from the BAME review on the pandemic and the impact of the pandemic, came out with no recommendations whatsoever. And to be honest, you can then see the frustration from many communities who feel disengaged and very disempowered by the very system that they are seeking to support them. They don't feel part of it. And Kezia, as you will know, even when you have legislation, even when you have policies that protect communities, they're still not being implemented. So just imagine the challenge that we face in terms of really shifting the mindset of this government to really think about, actually, what does this mean for gender parity? What does it mean for BAME communities not being able to achieve? It's really just not good enough. We've got to do a hell of a lot more.
So just a little reminder to everybody who's listening into this that they can pose questions, because at the moment it's just you and I having a fantastic chat, but people are encouraged to put forward more of their own questions. They can do that on the button below. I have a lot more for you though. Let's start talking about international development, because I know there's lots of people that have tuned in to hear your views on that. Congratulations on your appointment as the Shadow Secretary of State for International Development under Keir Starmer's new leadership team. Although in fairness, a few days after that happened, the government then announced that they're going to merge the Department for International Development with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. There are lots of people on this call who will know instinctively that that's a bad thing, and they'll know their own reasons why. But for the benefit of everybody else, can you explain why you think that's not a good move, and what it might mean for the future of kind of Britain's standing in the world?
Yeah. Well, firstly, can I say what a privilege it is to be, part of a brief that is life-changing, and really honoured that Keir has appointed me onto this. But also the fact that Keir has appointed some, very strong Labour women into very key roles gives a very strong message in terms of his own leadership and how he's trying to advance, gender parity within the movement as well. Yes, I mean, we all anticipated that as part of the integrated review, maybe there was the danger that DfID would become taken over by the FCO. But this decision by the Prime Minister came before the integrated review, which is likely to be finished by the autumn, I think. So the strategy of Global Britain will be out by then. And I think it's had so many vocal ex-Prime Ministers come out and sort of say, really question this decision. I think the question we have to ask ourselves, why would this government, in the midst of a global pandemic, when we should be showing global leadership, when we have seen a coalition of anti-globalists around the world, really pulling together and bringing heads of states together, what we have is a government that's in retreat, that is embarking on reshuffling a Whitehall department when there is nothing broken to fix here. It's a world-renowned department. Its independence has given us in the sort of soft index the kind of positions that we have seen, because actually DfID gives value to the UK taxpayer in a way none of the other government departments do. So I mean, official development assistance money is being spent more and more by the government departments. Under the Conservatives, it's 30% more. And there isn't the transparency in the way that there is for how DfID spends its money, which is obviously focused on reduction of poverty and addressing inequalities. And there's a lot of ODA money being spent by other government departments that has very little to no development impact. So this idea that somehow this is going to be best for Britain, and this is going to mean that we absolutely focus our money on those places that need it, absolutely not. We are going to be spending 50 million pounds of taxpayers' money undertaking this project, which is going to take, the Institute for Government have said that it will take 2 years to bed in this department. And all this is happening whilst there's a global pandemic. So when we should be showing global cooperation, when we should be supporting the multilateral system like the WHO, when we should be calling Trump out because he's withdrawn from the WHO, the only mechanism, the only system we have in the absence of anything else to coordinate the response, making sure many countries across the global south have access to medical equipment. And of course, in the absence of a vaccine, which is again something that we globally should be working to do, because when we do find one, when we're going to have mass manufacturing and then distribution, that can only happen when you have global cooperation. So the very things that we think that the government should be absolutely focused on, it is absolutely not doing it. So it's using all these warm words about how somehow this is going to make global Britain even greater. Well, actually the world is looking at us and thinking, why on earth would we do this to a world-renowned department? That is, the envy of so many. It is in the top 3 for aid expenditure, whereas the FCO, we know time and time again, is rated as very poor in terms of how it spends overseas development assistance money. And I think the most concerning is we have a Secretary of State, we have a foreign secretary who has been spending ODA money very poorly, who then decides a day before summer recess in a letter to tell us that there's going to be cuts of up to 3 billion to ODA money without any little detail. But what's really clear is this is a government that's evading scrutiny, because we need to know, and we have been pushing that actually where the cuts should fall is the repurposing of money spent by other government departments, because we know it doesn't have value for money, and we know it doesn't have reduction of poverty. And we need to know that existing programs, because of course we've got to see that we've got to show that we're learning lessons from Ebola. More women died from maternal death than they did in Ebola. So existing programming is so important. There's concerns from across the global south about access to healthcare facilities, for example, whether it's for maternal deaths. But of course, so many countries, we despite having the NHS, look how we've struggled. We've had over 65,000 deaths. So many countries come from a very weaker system. A third of people in the Yemeni population don't have access to healthcare facilities. People across the global south, whether it's South Sudan and other places, have very little ventilators. So this is a really real concern. And one of the things that we've been calling for is debt cancellation. I don't think, because of the lack of leadership of this government, that the G20 has gone far enough. It's talked about a moratorium for this year. It hasn't extended that to next year. These countries need to be spending that money on strengthening their health systems and being able to support their communities.
Do you not think, though, the blunt reality of it is a political calculation has been made? And if you're Dominic Cummings or Boris Johnson, and you're looking at what you need to do to maintain all of those infamous red wall seats across the north of England, places like Bishop Auckland, where the Tories have won a seat from Labour for the first time, I think, in maybe 100 years, for want of not being crass about it, but is the calculation not? I'm not sure there's a huge amount of appetite for aid in the Yemen amongst working class communities in Redcar and Bishop Auckland. Is this not just something that the government views easy to cut? And if it is, how do you, in your role, overcome that political mountain of making the case not just for what is right for those communities that need our help and support, but the political argument within the UK about why you need to spend there and not elsewhere?
I think the government will want us to make that political argument, and it will want to say that those in red wall seats don't care, but that's absolutely not true. I think if you look at polling, the UK public are absolutely proud of the work that we do in terms of reducing poverty. They absolutely believe that when there's humanitarian aid and crisis, whether it's climate disasters or conflict situations, that we must absolutely be out there and be supporting those countries. So And I think now, given the kind of global pandemic, there's an opportunity to show that global solidarity. You know, we are proud of the NHS. We need to make sure that other countries have, you know, universal healthcare, because when there is another pandemic, because this won't be the only pandemic, we've got to be able to have resilient systems that can come together and work together. And I think one of the things that I've seen that's been really encouraging around the polling around a vaccine is the British public absolutely believe that when there is a vaccine available, it's got to be available to everybody, including those that are the poorest, because of course we will see a second and third wave and this disease will just come back to hit the West if we don't have that. And that's why I say that we've got to be making the case for being globalist. And this is what we expect from the government, is actually we are in an era that we have got to work together, because the global challenges and the global priorities that we face, especially because we know this pandemic is going to mean a health crisis, an economic crisis, a human rights crisis, and a rights crisis. Social protections, global supply chains are going to be affected. So this idea that we can do it alone, and this idea that actually we must just protect ourselves, or all countries just must be very protectionist, I think is the wrong approach. And I think the British public know that, and we've got to really give, you know, be clear that actually even in red wall seats, they care about the world's poorest. You know, they do give. The British public are absolutely giving people. And the other point I would make is, Kezia, no person, I don't know any single person that spends 100% of their wages on themselves. So the 0.7% commitment is our moral duty. It's the very thing I think the British public absolutely are fully behind and know why it's important. And they also know that as a UK aid brand and the standing it gives us in terms of the world is because of the independence of development, and actually what development can achieve. This is not just about aid, it's about the impact that development is going to make across the world.
So Dominic Raab, as I understand it, last week said he's cutting, I think, £3 billion, but he'll still be able to maintain the 0.7% commitment because gross national income is coming down because of the forthcoming recession. Is it Labour's position then not to have any cuts to international development? Do you want to maintain rates as they currently are? That's a question we've had in from Owen Williams.
No, we recognise that there has got to be cuts made. I absolutely get that. Of course, we've had a drop in GNI. So, I mean, what we are saying, though, is that those cuts shouldn't come from DfID and DfID expenditure, because actually you get value for UK taxpayers' money. You get the effectiveness of development priorities. It should be repurposed from other government departments spend, because there, you know, the Newton Fund, for example, there's many funds that have been seen to have very little or no impact on development. And absolutely, it should be those where there is no value to the taxpayer and there isn't the transparency. That is absolutely what should be cut. So we're not saying we shouldn't. We absolutely understand that there's going to be an impact. But as I said, it's about repurposing other government departments' spend.
Can you talk to us a little bit more about how you, as the Shadow Secretary of State for International Development, keep yourself briefed and up to date on things like what is having impact and what isn't? Where do you get that information from? Who do you rely on?
So I would say we are very lucky that the aid sector is phenomenal. I mean, it's huge. I mean, Bond, you know, has about 400 organizations that work with it, big and small. I think it's so important to be engaging with a cross section of the sector. So very, very early on, we put a call out to the sector in terms of understanding what the impact of the crisis was across the global south. We had over 75 submissions, which was just amazing. We've been meeting with the CEOs of the big and small organizations. I've personally been reaching out to meet with individuals. So we get so much information actually from multilateral institutions to aid organizations, and from various places, and also from diaspora communities, because let's not forget, they are here and they understand, you know, they've been sending remittances back to their countries and supporting development in their own ways. And they're really interested in terms of some of the work that we do. So they do also, through backbenchers, feed in some of their concerns as well. So we get lots of regular briefings on what's happening across the global south, but across the development sector. And of course, there's lots of great DevEx and various media outlets that, you know, regularly sort of promote this, and Prospect magazine, and so lots of different ways of getting briefing information.
And if you were the actual Secretary of State, and there'll be many people watching this who would wish that to be so, what do you think your strategy would be? What would be the kind of the morals that you would apply? You talked right at the start of this about how you have a passion for gender and international development. Would that be a thread that ran through how you would run the department? What would you change? What's important to you?
the thing that we would change as internationalists in terms of labour values, we absolutely want to see a focus on inequalities as well. And that means about gender equality. We want to see climate justice at the forefront. One of the things that I really want to push for, I think this pandemic has shown now is the time to create a social movement around a global health strategy. We have absolutely got to be supporting countries to have universal healthcare and be able to have taxpayer systems that enable them to absolutely invest in their own countries. And that means having to challenge some of the IMF and the World Bank institutions around, how debt is formulated, and how we can support that. So, I want us to spend, not just think about aid, but almost go back to the principles of why actually Labour set up the department under Claire Shaw about development priorities. Over the last sort of 7 years under the Conservatives, we've seen DfID become much more bureaucratized. That innovation, the thought leadership, they've been really prevented. I mean, if you think about in-country offices, if you want to scale up programs, if you want to make a difference, you've got to have a relationship with host governments and be able to shape and negotiate and, build capacity. Of course, DfID hasn't been allowed to do that. It's other partner organizations that have the direct link with host governments. And so how could it ever sort of really make the impact that it wants to? It's all very well having programs, small programs, but you've got to scale them up. You've got to go to the root causes of issues, but you've also got to listen to countries about what their priorities are and not seem to be having this Western centric approach of imposing what you think the priorities should be. And so I think there's a challenge for us about how we build those relationships across the global South, not just in Africa, but in Asia and of course in Latin America as well. The focus of a longer term strategy. I think this has been one of the things with DfID is that funding and programs is very short term. It's a 2-year cycle within which you've got to plan what it is that you're going to deliver and then deliver it. I don't think that helps to make the impact. We've got to have longer term strategies, but what it is we want to do in certain countries with those governments and how it's going to make the impact.
Can you do everything everywhere, or do you have to have a very specific focus on a number of countries first? How would you approach that?
I think you have to focus on low income countries first. But I do recognise that there's poverty in middle income countries as well. But we've got to really be supporting those countries where there are conflict, where it's fragile states, where there's governance issues are difficult. And then again, of course, with low-income countries that are emerging out of conflict and wanting to set up structures and governance systems in place, how do we support them in terms of thinking about investment in public services? What is it about labour values that we want to export and work with other countries and sister parties as well? I think, creating social movements across the world has got to be done with sister parties as well. And so we've got to be building those links and working together to create social movements to bring about change, especially around universal healthcare.
Just before the pandemic struck, we were looking ahead to having COP26 here in Glasgow, and it felt like for the first time, certainly in my adult life, the issue of the age was climate change. Now, kind of 4 months into the pandemic, I'm beginning to wonder if that's changing and whether the issue will remain climate change or whether the focus might now become about the economy, not just in the UK, but across the globe as the pandemic stops being a health crisis and starts being an economic crisis. Do you have an instinct about that? Do you think climate change will be as prominent an issue as it was before, or do we need to adapt and change the way we talk about it and talk about the economics of climate change in this context?
I think it's a really good question. I think there's a huge threat that actually we could end up sidelining about climate justice. But of course, the UK has got the chair of COP26. So it is being challenged. I mean, we've seen that UK Export Finance wanting to invest in a pipeline in Mozambique, for example, shows that actually there isn't the policy coherence from across government, because actually DfID is spending money on building those communities, and what all this pipeline will do is displace a lot of people. I think there's a way that we can do it, and I think you're absolutely right. It's about the economic recovery. How do we change the conversation and make it relatable? What does green jobs mean? How do we, we've got to really think about what we mean when we talk about recovery, because there is an opportunity to actually bring climate within that. There's so much being done around whether it's electric vehicles, how do we transfer gas into hydrogen for homes, for example. So there's great innovation being done across the country. But I think we do need to make sure that we don't alienate communities about actually, is green jobs seen to be something technical? Does that mean somebody from a white working class background or any working class background means that they can't achieve that job, you know. So how do you link that in? And it's interesting talking to Liam, because actually part of his manifesto as the Metro Mayor for the region is talking about green jobs in linking it to manufacturing, and more people can kind of understand that when you talk about it from that perspective. But of course it's got to be part of our recovery back. You know, so it's down to us to make sure that we are raising the issue of climate justice and how important it is alongside this pandemic, because we will see more displacement of people. You know, those countries that haven't contributed to the changes in climate, actually they are the ones that are suffering the most, because across the global south we've seen what's happened around climate emergencies and you know, disasters for some countries.
Do you think your constituents in Standwell know what a green jobs revolution is or might be?
I think there's work to be done on it. I think it's absolutely right. I think it's how are we engaging people and getting them to understand what green jobs and how they're part of our recovery, and why actually climate has got to be at the fore alongside the economic recovery, you know, for the country, and understanding what the health impact is going to be. Absolutely. I don't think people do understand it across the country. I think we've got to make it much more relatable. We've got to engage them in the kind of conversations about how are we going to recover, how we're going to create jobs, what are those jobs for the future going to look like, how do you achieve them, what's the pathways to getting that job. It's got to be really simplified, the message. You know, no longer can we sort of, and how locally can people access some of these jobs. I mean, our region is, you know, renowned for the manufacturing sector. You know, the government unfortunately ignored it in terms of its package of recovery and support to this sector, but it's absolutely vital and key. And there is a way of actually creating more new jobs if we think about the sector, the automotive sector in this region, and the opportunities that it will give. But we've got to absolutely change the language of how we share that with people.
We're going to let you go in a minute because our hour is almost up.
Really?
It's absolutely thrilling. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and hope everybody that's tuned in feels the same way. One of the questions that we had in advance of the event was to ask you about what books or films kind of shaped your life. So I guess in the final few minutes, if you had a reading list or a film list that you would encourage people to kind of go away and have a look at after today, what might be on that?
Well, you know, I remember, gosh, reading a lot when I was younger. I loved Little Women as a book. It was amazing. But then when I was at university, I read a lot of Jack Kerouac, On the Road. I'm just trying, Khalil Gibran, into poetry. I always found that fascinating. I liked a lot of fiction kind of books, really. Especially when I was in India, I suppose I started to read Herman Hesse, The Data. I remember that because it had a huge impact on my life. So I think, yeah, Isabel Eberhardt, she was a nomadic traveller. Fascinating book, fascinating story about her life. I was always interested in sort of the beatnik travellers. I was a bit of a Jim Morrison fan when I was much younger, so read his biography on the Road. But then I think that sort of changed, shifted. It became a bit more philosophical, much more into poetry. And that sort of stuff. Yeah. Trying to think of other writers, loads. I mean, I just love books, so yeah, can't always think of the authors, but
can you still read now, because so much of your life is about briefings and papers and all the rest of it? Do you still get enjoyment from reading? I lost that when I was in politics.
To be honest, I really want to read more. There's so many books that I've just not been able to finish or read, and you're absolutely right, you just don't get the time, because the any minute you have, you're reading something related to your brief.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, very seldom do I get to pick up a book these days. I wish I could.
One day. Listen,
Yes.
Preet Gill, that's been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for your time. Just before everybody signs off, the minute that you do so, you'll be presented with a survey where you can let us know what you thought about this event. And it's also an opportunity to put forward ideas for future guest speakers and topics. So we encourage you very strongly, if you don't mind, just to take a minute or two just to fill that out. If you don't do it today, it will arrive in your inbox tomorrow anyway, so you'll be bombarded until that moment comes where you can let us know what you think. In the meantime, thank you so much for joining this Power Hour event at the John Smith Centre, and we hope to see you again soon. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.